to our panelists who will be coming up in a minute. And I will hand over to Lynsey Rogers, who will chair the first panel. But yeah, do stick around. There's a marketplace upstairs. There's more events happening today. And yeah, just thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Oh gosh, is that okay? Hello everyone, it's absolutely lovely to be here. I'm Lynsey and I'm really delighted to be chairing today's conversation about genre boundaries in romance fiction. I work in writer development, but I'm also a big romance reader, especially queer romance. So preparing for this event has been an absolute treat for me, and I hope you enjoy your day at the festival. So in terms of format, we're going to have a bit of a discussion. We're going to have readings along the way as well, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. So please do get thinking about what you would like to ask. So I'm joined today by three brilliant authors working across different forms, and I think they all prove that the romance genre is nuanced, it's revolutionary, and it's thriving. And I'm going to introduce our speakers first. So we have Radhika Sanghani, is a writer for The Telegraph, writing news, features, and profiles.
I didn't see it as romance or not, but I think that I've always loved reading kind of like rom-coms and kind of more contemporary things. It's just that I didn't necessarily want to write a book that ended with that kind of, or that focused on romance being the happy ending, the thing that's going to fix everything and make life better. So I guess I just wanted to write a book where it's actually about self-love And there might be relationships along the way, there might not, but that's not the focus. The focus is the character's own journey. So I guess I was kind of thinking about the genre and how to change it. It's just, I have no idea what this is marketed under now, to be honest. And I always used to joke as well, because it's a character going on a bit of a spiritual self-love journey as well, that it's almost like self-help disguised in a novel. And yeah, there was a lot of different things, I guess, that I was trying to bring into this book.
I definitely wasn't asked about, when you meet someone new and they're like, oh, what do you do? Oh, you write comics. What kind of superheroes do you write about? And so I think there's actually like a viciousness about me saying I'm a romance comic writer, because I think we've got an idea about what comics are, and comics being a genre as opposed to just a form that stories can be told in. And I think it's something that a lot of my early interactions as a reader of sort of like first queer stories I read in comic form is stuff that's coming from Japan, because they market manga to all different ages and demographics. So my first experience with that would be like yaoi genre and things like that. And sometimes you just start making what you like to see and giving it going.
So building on that, you've all kind of touched a little bit on like marketing and the process of being published. Can you say a little bit more about what that's been like to share your work with an audience and what the kind of responses have been so far? I mean, I guess, Kay, your book has not been out too long.
That's right, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks,
Yeah.
so it's not long.
Yeah, how's that?
Well, it's been interesting. Like I said, you're suddenly up against all these different thinking throughs of your work that maybe weren't with you at the time, but like afterwards you have this opportunity to think alongside the reader, and I wasn't expecting that. I think mostly I felt very nervous about this whole part of the process, obviously. But I love that the most is that most people who read the book are a lot smarter than me on the whole. So it's like, kind of really nice and like reassuring. I'm like, okay, yeah, no, you're right, I was doing that.
They make the depth.
Yeah, exactly. That's like, I think that's part of this. It's my first novel. I, haven't been in the public writing very long. It's only been a few years. So that part of it has been really extraordinary to me, especially queer readers, because there's so much careful and I don't know, I hate the word tender, but a lot of very careful thinking. And I feel like the book has found where it's supposed to be. That sounds so cheesy, but I think I'm like in the cheesy phase at the moment. I've had a really nice time. And yeah, that part of it has been extraordinary. I definitely like, in terms of romance, it's not really a word that comes up a lot with my novel, but it's such an interesting context to consider it within. So yeah.
Yeah, I relate to that. I feel like for me, I try and write the books that I want to read, which is probably cliched in itself, but it's like the only way that writing makes sense for me. And so I try not to have, like, to think about the reaction or how it's going to do in the world, how people are going to react to it, because that will just drive me crazy. Like, if I think of my potential critics when I write, I can't write. And so I guess I've kind of just learned to let go and just see what happens and see how it does and just let that be okay and just trust that this is a process and it will be what it needs to be. And I guess the nicest thing, like, my book's been out now the paperback just came out this year, but the hardback was out last year, so it's been out for a little while. And I have another one on the way, so it's like I can't get too attached because then there's more. But I guess it's really lovely when people say it's helped them in some way. And I know that as a writer, I don't want to be like didactic, like here are messages, like take this, learn this. Like, this is a novel, it is not actually self-help. But if it does help someone and make them feel a bit better or make them think about their relationship with themselves and to see if they can think of 30 things they love about themselves or even 3, that just really makes me feel, I don't know, warm and connected. So I'm grateful for that.
My way through to publishing is very different than standard publishing. I don't want to do too much detail. I come from a webcomic background where you just put the pages up each day. Well, can't all do one each day, okay? And so you get that immediate fan reaction, and you can respond or not respond, or maybe you've got it written behind the scenes, or maybe you're just making it up as you go, which is very dangerous. And then when I finished my first webcomic, I crowdfunded to get that sort of made into a box set, and that's what I've done with comics ever since. And in the past couple of years, because I know how to ship things to all over the world, because I've done it for my stuff, I started being sort of producer and editor of anthologies for other people. So being an editor and taking in other people's stories and then sending those out, really interesting, just to seeing what either side of it is, really. But comics and doing stuff this way without a publisher means that the books are out like instantly. Like the second they're done, they're done. Like, we've done the work, we want to get paid, out it goes. So that just makes things very different from the world of traditional publishing.
Absolutely. And I'm going to borrow a quote from Shades of A to frame this next question, which I think was from JD. For such a simple word, normal has hurt a lot of people. So I think all of you show that in your work that the sort of personal is inherently sort of political. How does this sort of influence you, and can you talk a little bit about the impact that sort of bad portrayal of underrepresented characters can have?
That's a
Yeah, sorry.
I just like the silence hang up there for a minute. Yeah, how do I think about that? And again, like, when I was writing Mrs. S, I think not while I was writing it, because I tend to read a lot of fiction while I'm writing. Like, I'll pick 3 books and I'll stick with them, just help set tone. But before this, I'd read a lot of, well, I had been reading Anne Carson's Eros, The Bittersweet, and I read a lot of Laurent Ballon, a lot of their work, but especially Desire, Love. I don't know if anyone else has read that. And I think both, I mean, a lot of texts about desire, especially, both those books kind of pivot around this idea of desire and how it functions. I mean, Laurent Ballon talks a lot about how genre isn't just literary, it's actually everyday, and there are all these different, you know, the world is sort of categorized in a way that set expectations. So I found that really interesting when thinking about romance. It's like as a genre, it's an expectation that gets set, right? And it's one of the most historic of the genres. And with my book, because I didn't think about it as being about romance, I really thought about it as a book about desire. And since then, I've had to think about how those things interact. Like, you've got desire, romance, and love, and how those things belong or don't belong to each other. But with this, I think like I was aiming to find like a language for sex, probably first and foremost, and thinking about that within the context of romance, and also within the context of like the personal being political is complicated, because in some ways this book is, maybe you guys find this too, it ends up being accidentally political, even if it's not necessarily what you want to have to answer to. And I think it's interesting because there's a prize for political fiction, and my book would never be considered within that prize. But in theory, it is, because it kind of is the politics of the body, which is far harder to quantify and far harder to make known, I think. And it was such a fine line, because I didn't want the book to have to explain my position as somebody who identifies as trans or somebody who identifies as queer, but I wanted it to be this kind of instantaneous reflection of that desire's impact on the queer body, I guess. And in a way, like, it ends up being romantic in other ways. Like, it's romantic for me to have done that. I don't know, there's like all these kind of spin-off romances around writing a book or around making anything creative. But yeah, sorry, that was a really rambly answer. I'm still like thinking about a lot of these things at the moment.
I guess for me, like, representation is kind of a theme within the book as well. Like, my character Nina is British Indian like me, and she's a journalist like me. And the similarities. But basically, I guess something that Nina realizes in the book is something I've noticed a lot, which is just that so often portrayals of, like, I can only speak for what I know, but, you know, British Indian people, it's just, when I read about this in novels or I see it on TV, it's always just very like about their race. And it's about the themes that are linked to the race, or like arranged marriage or whatever. And it's always very intense. And I guess what I wanted is just a book where the character happens to be British Indian. There happens to be some cultural stuff going on, but it's not the point of the book. She is just a relatable woman that I feel like anybody of any colour, and to be honest, any gender or anything can relate to, because she's just a human going on a journey. Yeah. And yeah, I also kind of in the book look at cancel culture, and she kind of, spoiler, makes like a little mistake when she's talking about race and seeing how that goes. And I guess by covering these themes, I'm not making a particular point. I just wanted to go near conversations that feel difficult to talk about. And I think sometimes with race, it's just difficult to talk about some of the nuances sometimes. And even I, as a woman of colour, feel that. So I wanted that to be within the book. Yeah, again, not to make a point, but a particular point, but just to show a wider range of perspectives. And I guess to be hopefully helping in some way to, you know, towards wider representation, just by virtue of writing the book I wanted to write as a woman of colour.
And that thing of a story, you can just put forth all of those nuances without coming down hard. Like, it's not that you have to, in 28 characters, 280 characters, like sum it up completely. And I mean, that's the thing, like I don't really tweet my opinions that much, because as far as I'm concerned, read my books, they're in there. And that like adds to the sort of nuance and grey area of everything. As far as the question on representation goes, it's a really tricky one, because I feel like there's this big push for good representation, and I struggle with the concept of good. I'm writing a story about angels and demons at the moment, and one of the main conflicts is what does good and bad actually mean? Because I personally feel like I'm going through my own villain era at this moment in time, and I'm just not relating to feel-good shows, and that's okay. And I suppose it's always just a problem of the amount of it there is. Like, the reason the second anthology we did was a trans masc and non-binary erotica anthology. And the reasoning behind that was this idea that in general erotica anthologies you get like maybe a couple of trans characters or non-binary ones sort of thrown in there. But then it becomes that they're the ones that have to be how all of non-binary people have sex. Like that they're the only ones representing that. But if you have a book of all of it in every story, people get to have a lot more fun just doing weird niche shit. Because what is sex except the niche that you want to particularly fill? Thank you. And it meant that the onus on good portrayal wasn't on any story in particular. And I think in so much of this thing, it's about just getting more stuff out there. So one isn't the story.
Yeah, definitely. An important point. I think we're going to go to our first reading now. Sorry, Tab, because you've just like spoken a lot, but would you like to share?
So this is the story I was talking about. This is Infernal Relations, which is a webtoon I'm doing at the moment. Webtoon is like an app that you can scroll through comics, so sort of this is the new digital era. It's about a death demon called Gregor and the angel ambassador that keeps flirting with him. This is a couple of chapters in, so I'm going to read along, which is the only thing worse than reading your own work is having someone else read it to you. Don't you worry that someone's going to notice how we are what? Oh, come on, I'm the only angel down here. They can't expect me to not make friends. Friends? Oh, that gets lost in translation too, I suppose. Enemies you like, that you do kind things for? So like, negative revenge. What? Like eye for an eye, but nice. We can laugh together. Fill the space. Next line, really. Malicious benevolence. I should have to try that out sometime. If you meet me on the lift after work, we can try and figure that one out together. Wink. And then it's big after work. Ding. Well, this is your usual stop. Want to get off? No. Wait, how do you mean going up it is? Wait, where are we going? Sorry, you get used to it. Where are we? My place, of course. You know what they say, heaven for the view, hell for the company. You live in the same tower as Incourt? Part of the angel perks. We're less of a job and more of a way of life. That's evil though, at least I don't need to make anger in my free time, but you always have to be good. Will I get you into trouble being up here? Showing a demon the light? No, oh God, I'll get a commendation. I thought we were being bad. I suppose that's a matter of perspective. This feels so wrong and so right. Can it be both? Shall we try? It's a little bit about how, for some people, sex and romance, they want to feel good, and some people, they want to feel really bad.
I absolutely love that comic, and I particularly loved the sort of play on the workplace setting.
Yes.
And obviously there's so much comedy in it as well. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that setting, but also in terms of your style and how that's kind of changed over the years.
Yes, so upstairs I've got my the last comic I did, which was like a Victorian triad thing called Sir Butler and Boy, which is all traditionally done, big like A3 inked drawings. Whereas this one, I was going from a very rigid, uptight story, which the repression is a big part of it, to something that I wanted to get more energy back into my work, a bit more fun, really. So taking more manga inspiration, screen tones. The text of it is that I'm using Clip Studio Paint. I don't know if people want to hear about the things I use for it. But the development is mostly around puns, and also I really like characters that have some kind of paradox about them. So Shades of A, the one we've got here, is about a openly asexual guy who gets dragged to a kink club by his best friend. And I think actually that kind of things that look like they don't work on paper, but you can explore in a character, is like a really interesting base to start with. Yeah, like how can this person exist or work? Because I think as humans, we've got constant things about us that are completely in conflict with, if you wrote it all out in paper, it doesn't seem to make sense, and yet it does, because we're human.
Yeah, absolutely. And so going back to kind of themes that connect across all of your work for the whole panel, one thing that really struck me was sort of observation and perception, and the sense of like public and private lives that all of your characters have. Do you want to say a little bit more about how you explore that in your work?
Yes. I think the idea of public and private is interesting to me. I think my book is set in a school, which I like I found myself in, as I've been talking about the book, referring to it a lot as an institution. I think like that idea of the institution, especially within like when you're thinking through like public space, is a very interesting arena for desire. Especially because the school is all girls, so that shifts the institution again, and it makes it into this kind of a really complicated place for reflections of femininity. And then of course the protagonist, and the book is first person, it's this very immediate present tense narrative. They're kind of, it's not explicit in the book, but they're wearing a binder, they're kind of, they've been out for a long time. As in the book, I use the word lesbian a lot, but there's a thinking through that's happening. There's maybe a bit more acuity of self that's coming to the fore as well, and that's incredibly private. But of course, that privacy it's never really, the intimate's never really private in the institution. I guess like,
Yeah.
of course, you're also being reflected back to yourself, and you're not invisible either. You become incredibly visible in those public spheres. So I think for the protagonist, like that kind of tension between public and private is like acute in the book. Like it's one of the things that drives, outside of the affair, which of course is like the sellable part of the book. That's the other factor that drove the plot for me as well, is that tension and how it plays out on the body, like how it plays out on the individual, how it becomes distilled, mapped, and like it's everywhere seen and nowhere known, I guess, is like the ultimate sensation in the book. But so that's the part that really interests me.
Even where the character is staying in the school with like paper thin wall between them and the nurse.
Yeah.
And I think also like in the naming
lack
of
of
some
privacy.
of the characters, but the nurse, the matron, it's also to do with like an institution where you are swapped out in favour of. I mean, there's a positivity to the namelessness too, but I think that too is like a very you become the public more than the private in that way as well.
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is like the idea of how much to share, because that's something my character figures out in her journey, and it's something I think about a lot as well. And what I find interesting is that every time I write a book and people read it, they're always like, which bits are you? I'm like, does that need to be the first question that we ask? It's awful. And I understand, and especially if friends and family read it, they might recognise random elements and then assume it's all me. And I just find it really hard because it kind of takes away the fact that I have an imagination and that as a writer I use it. And also because, of course I draw on experiences in my own life. I do 100%, and I draw on feelings and emotions and also sometimes actual tangible things that happen to me. But they don't always end up in the way that you might expect. Like most of me might end up in a character that's like an old man, not the woman who's the same age as me. And I just find that really interesting, of like when I'm creating and people, I guess the kind of like, what's the book and what's you? But I suppose more for my character, there's a lot around how much do you share and what do you do if it impacts other people? Like, where's the line? Can you just share about yourself? What if you share about your family too? What if it impacts them? And these are all things I'm still navigating, to be honest. When I first started in journalism, my mum, like British Indian, panicked, like, why are you sharing things about your life? Oh my God, don't air dirty laundry in public, etc., etc. And I had to we came up with a rule that I wouldn't write about my family or my sex life. And that was like the two things. And then my first book was all about sex. So I broke that through fiction. And then I'm just a bit like, as time's gone on, I've just had to be like, okay, I can be respectful and never write about them. But ultimately, like, I get to write about the things that I want to write about. And it's been a journey. And I think a lot of the public and the private and the observations and perceptions, for me, that's a lot about what do people think of you and expect of you, and actually where do you see yourself and what feels right for you, and kind of choosing that path.
I think the book that most comes to mind for me for public-private life would be the Sir Butler and Boy book, because in a short summary, it's about a young master, his valet, and a groundskeeper who, behind closed doors, reverse roles, with the young master becoming the boy and the groundskeeper becoming the sir, the valet being the butler. It's about the same, really. The entire book is based around BDSM scenes that they do together, and they're the only characters in the book. I made a decision early on not to include any other characters, which if you read like how to write an unproblematic gay character, make sure they have friends, like that they're not the only gay people in the book. And I'm like, these are the only gay people in the book. But it's creating that boxed in intimacy, but also at the same time exploring the fact that like during sex, everyone can be whoever they want to be. Like what you are outside of in the real world is almost irrelevant. That sex is like free play, pretend games, or it can be you, it can be something you're pretending to be, it can be anything. And that's just a really nice thing to play about with and explore that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of a sort of happily ever after. I think that's something you're all doing really interesting things with. Obviously there's a sort of, I guess there's a bit of an expectation in the romance genre of how that's going to play out. Do you want to talk about how you approach this, your characters, in sort of different ways that you've sort of played with that or expanded that idea? Without spoiling too much.
Yeah, I'm like, ugh.
I know, I always get stuck talking about the ending, which I then can't like say what the ending is. But I definitely, like, for me, it was a huge thing that I hadn't realised in myself had been kind of cemented. When I set out to write the book, like the catchphrase that follows me around is that one time that I said I wanted to write a horny lesbian novel, and like here it is. But I had this very like pure idea where I was like, I want to write a book that puts sex at its centre. Actually, for a lot of you worded that so beautifully. I think because it's like this opportunity to transcend the self and an opportunity to also like it within language. Like it's the one place where you don't feel like you're bumping up against it. Like you're able to do something different when writing about it as well, which is very similar to the Act 2, I think. But I wanted a beginning, middle and an end, and I wanted the end to be this happy ending, which ran against like the traditions of like maybe lesbian, non-binary, trans characters where one dies or like, one falls off a ladder. Something terrible always happens, or gets eaten by a dragon. But it's like, but in writing that, I was like, great, okay, so there'll be a sunset and there'll be white horses and it's gonna be great. And I sat down to, I don't write in order, so I write like, I know it's really stressful. It's like it's all like I don't have a plan, so
just make it really hard for you.
Yeah, it's fun though. Then you can be surprised, and also it gives you a chance to think through what you're doing, because I thought about I left the ending until the middle part of my writing process, and I was like, oh God, this isn't gonna work, because queer desire, I mean any desire, doesn't really function this way. The idea of a happy ending that ends up in like a coupledom or it's a really hard thing to attach happiness to, I think, because of a few of those reasons that I was talking about before, like that idea of genre is like this expectation that then becomes an obstacle to happiness, because you can't, that thing is not necessarily the point. And ultimately wanting it is what gets in the way of being happy, so it's like this complete conundrum. And so for the ending of this book, I really have to sit down and think about what a queer happy ending would be. And of course it can be anything, because that's the best thing about being queer, is that like happiness is like multifaceted. And I can't like talk about what the ending actually is, but I think like I find it very hard to be proud of the book, I think, because like I was saying to you guys before, you disassociate mostly from the book once it comes out. But I am really proud of that ending. Like I am proud of how I managed to navigate what, it's an ending that you can call happy. Even if I described it to you, it might not sound like that's happy. To me, like that's what a happy ending ended up being for this character in this situation.
Absolutely. I think particularly from a queer perspective, like it gives that sense of freedom.
Exactly, like a futurity, like there's like you want this kind of never-ending potential with queerness, and I hope that's what the ending manages in the end.
It absolutely does.
Well, you have to say that.
No, I agree. It's such a strong sense of self. And sometimes that's about your personal journey, like the character's personal journey, as opposed to the specific arrangement that they end in, which is very similar to yours.
Definitely that. And like, I think that's what I always focus. To be honest, that's kind of what I care about most when I'm reading a book and I really connect to a character. Is I care about their emotional journey and their growth, and obviously things happen, and I like plot, but it's not always the thing I'm so hung up on. Like I actually just want to know how how they shift and change, and that's what I'm interested about writing as well. So yeah, I didn't want, like I get tired of the happy endings where everyone ends happily ever after in love and married. Like it's not helpful for me as a human in this world to read those all the time. Like it's exhausting and stressful. And I think in times in my life, I definitely put way too much emphasis on a romantic relationship being the answer to my happiness. And even though I know that, and I know that that's not healthy, blah, 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 like it's been ingrained from a young age. And I guess I want to, kind of like with the representation stuff, at least just show other options. Because I also like consuming romance novels. I read them, they're fun. But I think it's dangerous if you read too many and that's your only idea of a happy ending. So I just really, really wanted to write a book where a happy ending can be so many other things as well. And like, it's like without, I guess, giving too much away, but I mean, it's kind of obvious in some ways that my character will go on some kind of self-love journey. She may get there. But that the sense of like happiness being, and love also being so many other things, like love for yourself, love for a family, love for a new community you found, like friendships you never knew you could have, people who genuinely see you and get you, like connections. It doesn't have to be romantic. And I know we all know that on some level, but I do think that in our society it can get lost. And I know that I've succumbed to it. So I wanted to just do something to help anyone who's in that space or just needs a break from it, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, and there's that thing of you're going to get married, but no one really, there's never the what now. Happiness isn't like big level goals being chucked down on you. It's not the big things, because the happiness from that like massive event fades quite rapidly. And it's how you figure out that day-to-day low-level satisfaction as opposed to highs. But like happiness and highs is a different thing. But that's just mental health talk. That's not really.
That's important too, I think. Talking about, you know, like,
in reference to like happy endings and things like that, it depends on me which book I'm writing. Some of my comics I have written all the way to the end, and I work to that script with like adjustments as I go. Sir Butler and Boy, I just winged it. It was a break in between a project when I was renovating a house, and I wanted some Victorian grandeur when I was covered in dust and mould, and it was awful. So just something, it's escapism really, that and they've got a beautiful Victorian house, and I was like, one day.
It's a bit of fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely, but it wasn't the romance, it was the house being nice. But it's a book about 3 Victorian men, and so there's that thing about killing your gays, and I'm like, this was a long time ago, they're already dead. You start asking yourself, like, where can the happy ending be for people who aren't allowed to be openly in love with each other? And the answer to that is not being found out until you die. Like, it's the, like, where's the happy ending there? So you talk about the, like, kill your gays trope, but the ending of the book is a nod to this idea that all of, like, throughout the book they send little notes to each other. The ending of the book is like the collection of notes, like it's been found years later, to almost try and place it in a time, but also think about that the happiness was that this existed, and it no longer exists, but it was. And that's valuable.
I love that. For my second book, I'm working on that. I do the queer archive as well.
Oh, brilliant!
And like just this idea, like, I don't know, the ephemera that can and can't be captured, because I guess like in text there's so much undoing sometimes of like that early queer happiness. There's too much like reassignment and categorization. But yeah, the idea of like notes, I love that. Like this idea that like, again, like futurity, this like going onness within that too. That's a nice happy ending.
I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the influence of family in all of your work, whether that's sort of biological family, found family, or the absence of that sort of familiar influence. Do you want to say a little bit about how that impacts, the sense of community impacts your characters and their development?
In some ways, my book is very much about family, and it's about Nina, but it's also about her mum, Rupert, and it's the mother-daughter relationship I find fascinating, just generally in life. And I've really made it the focus of this book. And I've written, when my publishers agreed to publish the book, they were just like, one of them, she was like, I just love that you've done a mean mum, because I have a mean mum too, and no one ever writes mean mums. And I was like, yeah.
And if they do write a mean mum, they're like, oh, she's so unrealistic. Like, yeah.
And I've written a mean mum, and I just think, I don't know, again, that's something else I found a lot in novels, like this black or white, this black and white thing with a character being good or bad. And actually, that to me is not true of life. I like exploring the grey in between, and I like it especially with families, where there can be a lot of love, like say, like this is, you know, healthy enough, it's not like toxic and terrible, it's healthy enough, there's love, but there's meanness, and like how do you handle that? Like how do you handle a lot of criticism? Like that's what my character has to go through. And how do you, I spoke about my personal experiences with like my parents' boundaries and mine, and how that works, and how do you, like, I guess, live your life without them approving of every aspect of who you are and what you do. And I just wanted to explore all of that stuff. And actually, I have a new book coming out soon, which is called I Wish We Weren't Related. So if you're into that theme, like, save it for that one. It goes into more detail about all this stuff. And again, it's just about that messiness of, like, when there is love, but there is also complication. And how do you navigate it? What does that look like?
I mean, I guess, Kay, for you, thinking about the protagonist kind of going to this institution and finding a bit of sort of affinity with the house mistress as well, but still having these kind of phone calls to home, but the sort of distance of that emotional connection. And
I guess there's two things happening. I love the idea of romantic potential outside of like normative romance. So like I love like I think in like queer community there's like all these amazing versions of romance, right? Like, and the way that you can fall in. So the house mistress, they have what I think is a very romantic relationship, because the younger protagonist kind of looks to the house mistress in this institution that's very straight and normative as like a person, I don't know, like it kind of sounds cheesy, but almost like a mentor, like someone who's like able to hold them in a way that like the architecture won't, I guess, you know. I think it's incredibly romantic. I also think that like, it's a complicated thing to try and say, but the family aspect of the book too, obviously there is this kind of like very tenuous connection with the mother figure. The father isn't speaking to the protagonist. It's very like, I didn't want to land on that too heavily, I think, because it's so well known. Like we, you know, that feeling is like able to be understood just by in statement. But the mother is like a more complicated relationship, and I wanted to show how that very specific response where your queerness, the fact of who you are, makes somebody feel ignorant, and that's where like a lot of that then viciousness or that distance can come from. And maybe I'm too forgiving of the mother in the book, I'm not sure, but I think you end up still wearing that as the protagonist still wears that relationship in a way where they have to be more self-aware than the mother, and you end up that switch that happens with parents and queer children that can happen, where it's like your parent changes to you as well. I think like that distance can also, you know, signal to that a bit too. But it's, again, like I didn't think it's come up a bit, that idea of like the protagonist's empathy for their mother, but I don't know if I would call it empathy. I think I would call it like a forced understanding. Like you have to find ways to understand this thing that's changed so suddenly because of who you are, you know, if that makes sense. That was a bit rambly again.
No, that makes sense. Tab, I guess I was thinking particularly in like Shades of A, thinking about sort of Anwar's relationship with his family and the influence that has.
Yeah, though, honestly, this has been such a long time since I read this. I've got like a couple of threads, but nothing really concrete to follow. So if you're happy, we could go on to the next one.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, actually, I'm just looking at the time. I'm thinking, Radhika, would you like to share a reading?
Sure, yeah. I'm going to just share this really slightly random bit of where my character is at a wedding and just has a moment of like realizing, okay, I decided just like 5 minutes ago to read this bit, so it is really okay. So she's at her former best friend's wedding. Nina only stopped dancing when Jazz clinked his knife against his glass to do her speech. The night before, she tried to convince Joe to break patriarchal traditions and do the big speech herself. But Joe had refused on the grounds that it meant she wouldn't be able to get shit-faced. Nina's feminist arguments had fallen flat in the face of such faultless logic. Thank you, everyone, said Jazz. I just want to say a few words today about my beautiful, amazing wife. I never thought I'd find someone like Joe. I honestly didn't think I was deserving enough. She's so intelligent, hilarious, kind, caring, and I think you can all agree she's also bloody gorgeous. The guests all clapped and cheered. Nina felt several emotions stirring within her. She knew exactly how Jazz felt. His words about Joe were exactly how Nina had started to feel about herself. I feel so lucky to be with someone so undeniably talented and strong, said Jazz. And Nina beamed as she thought about Joe's mirrors and her own strength and talents. Joe is one of the most wonderful people I've had the privilege to meet, and I fully plan to continue appreciating her every day for the rest of my life. Nina felt tears prick her eyelids as she thought about her own self-love vows. It no longer felt like a chore to appreciate herself. She was starting to love herself without thinking. Joe has helped me become a better person. I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for her. Nina realised tears were sliding out of her eyes. If she just changed the word Joe to Nina, it was precisely how she felt about herself. She'd helped herself become a better person, growing daily and constantly trying to improve herself. She wasn't perfect, but she was a decent work in progress, and she was so proud of all the hard work she was doing. The results might not be obvious to anyone but herself, but she knew how far she'd come. She wouldn't be who she was today if it hadn't been for all the tears and the failures. Anyway.
Sort of building on that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of like spirituality in Nina's journey. I'll use the journey word. And I love that you said in the acknowledgements of the book, you know, for your own kind of spiritual self-love journey, a lot of ideas and theories become a part of you. And I just wanted to sort of ask about that.
Sure. I guess like, there's probably no context for any of these things. It was a really random bit to read out. But I think I wanted to read that bit because it just reminded me, like I've been to so many weddings where all these, like the speeches are so beautiful about the other person, and I just really liked the idea, I guess, of my character having a moment realising she can feel that way about herself too. And the way we view romantic love, the language we use, can also be used to describe yourself. And that talking about this, and then the spiritual side of things, like her spiritual journey is really integral to the book. And that's definitely formed, you know, as you said, by me and the journeys I've been on and things I've learned. And I guess, this isn't a talk about spirituality, but for me, just having a slightly wider view on things allows me to not take small things so seriously, and it just gives a bit of space. It creates more space and expansion and more acceptance. Like that's one of the biggest things in the book. Like there's a bit that people always quote back to me actually when they read it, and it's clearly landing, which is where my character comes across this old ancient Asian fable where the message is essentially good, bad, who knows, and the idea is like you never know what something means. Like this guy loses his horses and it's seen as bad, but then actually, like, I can't remember actually, I'm doing this really badly, but things happen and you just never know if they're good or bad.
Come back from the woods
with
something.
Yeah, they come. So the bit I remember most is like his son falls off a horse and everyone's like, oh no, that's terrible. But then his son can't get conscripted into the army and they're like, oh, that's amazing. So there's, just basically life, you just never know what it means. And I think these kinds of things that I've just been learning over the years have helped me so much, and I just wanted to put them in there to kind of, I guess, help other people remember it doesn't always look, it can mean something else, basically.
And sort of thinking back to sort of themes that crop up in everyone's work, another thing I wanted to talk about was sort of expectations or rules, whether they are sort of spoken or unspoken. They're all things that have a huge impact on your characters within their stories. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that kind of, how that pressure feels for them and how it affects their development, I guess.
About what, sorry, about the rules?
About sort of rules and expectations.
Oh, yeah, expectations. They're just awful, generally, I think. Like, should stress me out. I try not to do anything if I feel like... I'm saying the word should, I'm like, I should not do this, should. I guess, I think just society has a lot of expectations. I was talking to some new friends last night just about the way we try and put everybody in boxes, and we might not even know we're doing it, but it's like a weird thing that humans try and do, or to see who someone is and use labels. And I think there can be so many expectations put upon people, and I guess for my character coming from like a community, a particular community, that happens more, I think, in that community, in my experience anyway. And so it's very much like her journey of kind of what I said earlier, just trying to figure out what's right for her and I think expectations can be really heavy. And I think so often there can come a point where we might have been following them without even realising. And I find that really interesting, actually questioning, do I want to do this? Did I want to do that in the past? Or was it just an expectation that I hadn't realised I was trying to meet?
So thinking back more widely to the genre, I guess I wanted to touch on the fact that the romance genre has seen a sort of huge rise in sort of queer stories, queer fiction, particularly sort of centering more queer joy, which is lovely. What would your sort of hopes for the genre be in the future, you know, particularly for LGBTQ identities or marginalised identities? Like, what's explored? What do you want to see more kind of shared in the genre?
I'm excited about more queer villains. I think that's
Well, yeah.
I mean,
similar feelings recently about like queer villains.
well, the best villains are ones that you absolutely agree with the message, just not how they're doing it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah.
that I really struggle with. If a villain's not good in like a action movie or something, I'm just like, ugh. They need to be memorable. They need to be something you're like, oh, you're kind of right there. Oh, it's complicated.
Yeah, you've got to relate.
There's that writing theory thing that like your story, your protagonist is representing like the hypothesis with the villain being the opposite opinion, and the story of them fighting the villain is how you are convincing your reader how what your antagonist is going for is the right way of thinking. And the villain has to be good for that reason.
Yes.
Anyway, that's
complicated thing to write.
where were we?
I don't know. I think did I interrupt?
Mm,
No, I didn't. I just said something.
yeah, it's your go. Representation. What would you like?
Me. I like all the language around all that stuff is so complicated, isn't it? I think like, you know, I mean, you kind of answered this before when you talked about queer villainy, but also you talked about just the more queer writers. I don't say queer voices because then I think you automatically don't read it as fiction. I think it's really important to let queer authors be fiction writers. I think sometimes there's too much relaying back to the self and the individual, and like that, and that's a place where the personal being political is quite complicated. But I do think the more, like, I don't want to be the only. The sex that I write in this book is like, that's. Now I'm going to bring it back to me again, but it is my lived experience, of course. Like what you were saying earlier, like the way that you write isn't this cold intellectual cis white man thing that's been like promoted throughout the years, where somehow you're detached but a genius. Like, of course, you're constantly writing what you know, like it's unavoidable. But I don't want to be the only, like, you know, I got selected for this Granter list this year, and like a lot of the interviews that come up are like, they get it wrong all the time. I'm supposed to be the first non-binary person. Well, I'm not actually a transmasculine. And you're not asking anybody else how it feels to be the 8th woman on the list, or the 10th, the 95th man. Do you know what I mean? Like it gets very frustrating. And I think the more work that there is, the more the work can be like, can reflect how multifaceted like queer life and queer living is. I think like just more is my answer basically. And give authors a chance to be authors and creatives a chance to be creatives without only selling in the LGBTQ plus category on Amazon. Do you know what I mean? Like it'd be nice. Is that a good answer?
Very good.
Yeah,
very good.
I think like I'm feeling the pressure of that a bit, and like I just constantly having to, that personal political thing. If I'm in an interview where, you know, it pivots towards identity, or well, can you explain what transmasculine means? I'm like, do I have to explain that, or can you do the
Could you
couple?
explain how gender works?
Yeah,
because
could you
I have
explain
a lot of questions
exactly.
about why this one is fine
Yeah.
and then this one gets its own word.
And you get lots of weird anecdotes as well, where like people tell, oh yeah, I've got some turfy friends. I'm like, why are you telling me that? Like, why are they your friends? Like,
That
I don't
makes me feel
understand.
so
Like, you really become a
comfortable.
receptacle. Like, this is the thing, like, you become a vessel into which a lot of that gets poured, and it's very uniquely tiring. And also very hard to navigate, like one-on-one, where I'm like, okay, if I don't answer this question, then I'm a dick, and if I do, like, I don't want to be responsible for the entire trans experience, because that's literally impossible, and also the opposite of the point.
Yeah.
Because it's supposed to be slightly illegible. It's supposed to be this thing that like is allowed to be, and it happens in the book too, right? Where you don't have to have this perfect understanding of something in order to respect it and in order to let it unfold. and give yourself time to be a part. I don't know, it's something that...
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting about Mrs. S in particular, you know, because she has such presence in the book and control, I guess, in that setting, but then the protagonist sort of says, you know, there are things that she will never understand, she will never know, and it's having to sort of make peace with that actually...
Yeah, I think the way in the book, if it's kind of after sex, I think, when that happens, and it's like to do with the binder and this idea of masculinity, and I think like I wanted to be delicate with that conversation. I think as well, like there's no, I'm not talking about queer villains, maybe queer morals, there's no perfect response in those situations either. Like for the protagonist, there's no way of being like, let me tell you about how gender works, you know, you can't like suddenly give a lecture, because also I don't know. Like all I know is like, I don't know, it's a complicated thing, and you know that you only have a small window of opportunity, and how can you possibly make sense of it in that 30-second interaction? And there's so much other self carried forward in those questionings as well, and like people put too much of themselves in the front of those questions as well. Like when somebody asks me about that stuff, they're not asking because they're interested in me, they're asking because they're interested in themselves. Like it's a, you know, it's like that reverse. Yeah, it's like it's complicated, very socially complicated, those situations. And yeah, I hope, I mean the book is just like a tiny glimmer of that, but I hope that it works. I hope it makes sense to other people as well.
If I can bounce off your idea about putting the personal in, one of the most recent anthologies we did was like a sci-fi non-binary one, and it was so great to just be able to make shit up, like as in make a world where like it's this sort of like imagining sort of futures, which there is no lived experience of that, because and how like medical advancements might change how we view gender, and you can't live experience that because it doesn't exist, and you just make it up, and that's really fun to play around with. It was really nice to give people an opportunity to do that. When it comes to representation in like romance and things like that, the sort of two things I seem to be coming back to at the moment is older people and ugliness. Because it feels like romance books have to be sexy covers, like, and we talk about like attraction, and the only thing we can talk about is like the physical attraction of the person, and if they're not typical hot, will the readers pick it up? And I mean, like, you hear horror stories, well, they're not horror stories, they're real stories, of romance novels where one of the people on the cover is like a person of colour, and they make less sales. Shit like that. Which you feel like you have to put the most typically attractive people on a cover to sell it to people, or have characters that are like smoking typical hot. But I want to ask, do you? And this is something that's really weird in comics form, because I'm not just writing it and people filling it in the brain, I'm literally drawing it, and I have to... It's a real sort of challenge in myself about, because when we talk about how we draw people, if I draw someone with like a lazy eye, or like part of like their face is sort of like a little bit misaligned, which everyone is, if you ever tried to buy glasses, everyone's got a wonky ear. But if I drew wonky ears on everyone, I'm a bad artist. Like, I can't draw people. And that's been a real challenge, like looking at that in my own work about like how you draw people and what is like drawing a beautiful character. Big challenge, like, because, you know, all of it feels very, is it me, is it society? And you can't unmeld it sometimes. And I too am susceptible. I don't know, is there anything you want to bounce from that?
I mean, I kind of just agree
with
you both. Like, I just more, basically just more of everything, like more of the things we don't see enough of. Just more variety, diversity, variation, just all of it, and like that's what I want. And I don't know, like and I also really agree with what your point about, you know, not just wanting a queer bit to sell in the queer bit. Like I'm writing.
I feel guilty saying that. Do you know what I mean?
Really?
Like, yeah, kind of weirdly, because of course it's also my most important part of like audience. So that's like, it's so important to me. But
I guess it's just remembering something can be many things at once. Yeah. Right? Like it doesn't just have to have the one label.
Yeah, exactly.
And
books
I'm writing.
Can be shelved 2 places. You can buy. How about you buy 2 copies?
No, it's just true, and like, I'm really thinking of it now because I'm writing something new now, which is like my first YA book, and it's going to be kind of like Buffy the Vampire Slayer vibes, but there's also a queer love story in it, and like it's just in it. You know, it's not a queer book; it just has that in it. And yeah, I just am thinking a lot about genres, I guess, and how really it's not my job to try and think of the label. It's my job to write the story I want to tell, and that's just all I can focus on. Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. Kay, do you want to give us a reading?
Oh yeah. I've been kind of just like holding this like a baby chicken. I'll try and balance it somewhere. Sorry if it drops. So I'm going to read. Doesn't need too much explaining. It's from early on in the book. Nothing's happened yet between the protagonist and Mrs. S, but spoiler alert, something will. I mean, I don't know if it's a spoiler alert, is it, for the book? But they go for a swim. We come out of the trees and stagger further down. The slope is steeper now. A sound of water increases. She crouches, picks a clover, and bites behind its head. She doesn't offer or ask me to do the same. Instead, the flavour is announced, sweet, something like honey. Wonderful, she confirms. Her personalities catch like loose thread on a branch, the old-fashioned headmaster's wife and this person, setting her teeth to a stem's nape, stood tall in her pink shorts. Almost there. Scree is loose under my feet, water appears, a clear river. Heather makes soft mounds, she whips through the bracken, points to a distant fell and suggests climbing it, not today, but one day. I am hopeful. We drop down onto a track. There is nothing but the rhythm of our shoes on a dusty surface, birdsong, breath, focused in the heat. I want to ask her how they found this place, but the quiet is too lovely. Familiarity, a new familiarity, this time bodily. Little clutches of fabric, the swipe of our thighs. This is it. At first I can't see anything, only slabs of grey stone. She moves towards a copse of only 5 or 6 trees, slender, silver bark, green leaves. I watch her first, standing at an edge, peering down, pleased. It needed to be as good as she remembered. Without waiting for me, she removes her white shirt, each button a piece of my own spine undone. Her swimming costume is an athlete's, black, streamlined. I am surprised by her strength. She adjusts the fit, a finger slid underneath the short straps, then the place where the suit meets her hips. She catches me watching her. I blush. She calls to me. My anxiety has its own heartbeat. Desperate for the cool across my sticky face, I wear a sleeveless t-shirt, the binder hidden underneath. Underpants too, the t-shirt's hem past my hips, stopping mid-thigh. You'll go in wearing that? Yeah, no costume. I didn't bring one with me. Never thought I'd be warm enough to swim. Well, little did you know. She accepts my lie. My costume balled up in my underwear drawer. I no longer know how to wear it. I reach her at the edge. She has waited for my reaction. Below is a large waterfall, a pool eroded beneath it, bigger than I imagined, enough to spend time swimming to either side. Jewelled surface, a fish, brown trout, she explains, is visible deep on the stony bed. It's beautiful. It is. She clambers down and dives, muscle, water. Her back is a swimmer's back, all arch and grace. For a moment, I can't move. She doesn't hurry me, treads water, calm. I grip the edge of my toes, promise myself I'll jump at the count of 5, but only manage on 10, hopping forward. I can't make the same shape as her. Rush of rock at my back, relief of vanishing beneath the bright surface, t-shirt ballooning around me. I open my mouth to drink, to taste the cold, reappear to her face a few feet from mine. She smiles. There you are. We haul up to the waterfall, a large flat rock partially submerged, able to be clambered onto. Matching flecks of our forearms, she admires my brawn, I pretend not to hear. We sit side by side underneath, she draws up her legs, the crease at her knee. Here she does not know, does not mind what she gives away. water hammering our heads, necks. Without warning, she slips back in, completes a few lengths at speed. Front crawl. I float. If I could choose a different chest, I would choose this water. If I could choose a different body, I would choose this water. I say the last line aloud, river slipping on my tongue. What? She swims towards me. Slowly. Breaststroke now. What did you say? Nothing. But of course, nothing. She rolls her eyes. I roll mine back.
Thank you. I'm just going to come to audience questions in a second, so prepare yourselves. I just wanted to ask a little bit about tension and how you sort of build that in the novel. I think particularly when you said earlier about writing out of order, sort of how you sort of maintain creating that atmosphere, and that sort of the prose is very precise and sort of just how you sort of brought dialogue into that as well, and sort of maybe played with, I guess, the reliability of the narrator and what they're reflecting on.
I'll answer the question about tension, I guess, because it was really hard. Like the book is like uniquely exhausting, I think. The feedback has been similar. I think not necessarily. I didn't want to like challenge the reader, but I wanted. I don't know. Desire is like this pure. It's like the purest fiction, right? Like desire is a perfect form of fiction. Like it's so. It's almost impenetrable and hard to reflect in that way. Hard to do it justice, right? So I had to try and figure out how to create an instant of desire, because most of desire feels like it's like lightning speed, but also the time is stretched. There's a funny thing to time. I think I remember, like I was talking about Anne Carson and Eros the Bittersweet, and I think when she's translating Sappho, she talks about how Sappho used these different tenses in the ancient Greek. So, and for anything to do with desire, it was always this very like forward-thinking present tense. And the style that I chose the book was like uniquely impossible, because it's like so immediate. It's so like the size of the book's world is so small that I really didn't have a lot to write about, except this kind of like second by second, minute by minute like prose. And I had to go off instinct with it, really. Like if I was starting to feel bored or like chafed by it, I would stop and get rid of that. And it helps to, I think if I tried to write that book in order, it would be so stressful, because it's you wouldn't be able to find the energy, I think, to finish it, which is why I tend to, when I write, I think of a scene and then I'll write a long list of scenes, and then after the fact I'll kind of puzzle piece everything together. And that definitely helped, because if you trying to maintain that style for longer than like a few thousand words at a time is really hard. So breaking it apart and then having that kind of puzzle aspect at the end really helped.
I mean, I could ask many, many more questions, but I want to give you all a chance to ask any questions. Would anyone like to jump? Oh.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone. This has been such a fascinating panel. I wanted to ask a question about kind of queer erotics and their marketability or their marketplace, because we have kind of extraordinary resources in things like Archive of Our Own, or we have evidence that there's a huge quantity of writing on and interest in kind of queer desire, but the publishing industry does not always love to think about sex in the same way, or to think about kind of the erotic in the same way. And I wanted to ask about kind of, obviously self-publishing or kind of publishing through Kickstarter is one way around it, but if you've seen kind of movement in that, or what you think might happen there.
This is almost a different soapbox going on from that, is that marketing self-published erotica is incredibly difficult when we use 4 websites on the internet and they all dislike it. The internet is now 4 places and we hate all of them. What have we wrought? No. And that's really complicated about the fact that I can't put comics like these online anywhere if I want to be able to publish them about anywhere. And so the only way I can Pedal My Filth is through an actual book now on mail service. It feels like we're going back to trenchcoat back alley days with it. So that's complicated. And it's always a tricky one for me on panels like this because there's sex in all of your books, but it's whatever level of imagination the reader wants to decide that it is. Whereas we're just drawing it. Sir Butler and Boys are a funny book because I was like, there's like, you don't see anything, it's all implied. Like it's not quite hiding behind a lamp as they walk across a room. What's that? That's, I know what movie it is, but I can't remember it. Austin Powers, there we go. It's not, it's not like that. It's more like what can you imply is happening? How can you have the filth without it? But the anthologies themselves are explicit. And we have a lot more rules governing that than written stuff is. So it's always a weird time sending it to the printer. Depending on the book, I've got like some of it's just like a faceless upload it thing, and the other one is I've got a specialist print guy who looks through it all and tells me if like the black text is right or not. He's reading it for the text. But going back to your question thing, I don't really know. I feel like we are weirdly heading towards like this sort of puritanical place again, and how do we stop that? That would be great. Any thoughts?
I got pretty lucky. Like obviously my book's quite explicit, I think, in terms of what's out there, and I'm with a Fourth Estate, the literary imprint of HarperCollins, so it's quite a big. Like, you know, I think my publishing journey's been quite like commercial, I guess. Like even though it's literary fiction, another genre that's very complicated. I just got really lucky. Like I think you have to really got to trust your instincts a lot. Like I hadn't shown anyone my work for years and years and years, and then I did a master's at Glasgow University in creative writing, and it was like it was only a few years ago, my mid-30s. I was like, if I do okay at this, then maybe I'll give this a shot, and if I don't, no big deal, plan B. And just kind of bit by bit, it went well, and I had a tutor that really understood what I was trying to do, even though they wouldn't define as queer, and then I got an agent that really understood what I was trying to do, and just was very supportive, and also very aware of not having to, they were all very aware of not making me adjust or change, of taking the book on for exactly what it was in the first draft. And when the publishing process is so strange, and I'd never done it before, and people bid on the book, and then you meet with different publishers, and that experience, even though it was big publishing at Penguin, the editors that I met had all taken the book, and they were like, we wouldn't, the changes that we would make would not be to the essential part of the book, which is the sex. So I feel lucky, and I work with Kish at Fourth Estate, Kishani, and she, I think, has made huge changes in the commercial world for proving that you can sell a book, because of course for them it comes down to sales as well. There is that aspect to it. They never make me deal with the pressure of that, which is really amazing. I think I work with people who are trying to make a difference, even though that's so hard, and it's such a huge behemoth industry. I feel very lucky to be in the part of it that is doing some good. I think is, which is such an annoying answer, because again, I've just had a really nice time. It's like I haven't, and it's complicated.
Hey, we hear the bad stories so much.
I know, this is the good
So
story.
that's
I'm on the
great.
good end of it, I think,
Yeah.
and I'm very hopeful from my experience that things are changing, and there have been books that have proved that change can happen. I think probably in the last few years, Garth Greenwell's Cleanness was a huge book that proved that that kind of writing, erotic is a word that I find so complicated, but sex writing can be intellectual, it can be intelligent, it can be important, and I think that those, even though historically there are so many queer books that show that anyway, I think in the current climate it's almost like people think it's happening for the first time, like all the reissues of Andrew Hollow, and then everyone forgets about Salmon Delaney's memoir. I think there's like this forgetting of sometimes. But yeah, for me, it's you know, fingers crossed. It's some parts of it are looking good anyway. I hope.
And sometimes publishers have to work within laws as well.
Yeah.
Like it was a blip in the sand where a couple of years ago, the UK banned like squirting, fisting, face sitting from like all production of pornography within the UK.
Did they?
Yeah, they did.
Oh.
There were.
How?
Well, I can only just.
Like technically, how can you manage that?
Like a bunch of femdom sites shut down immediately, and it's that thing of like we need to protect people from hurting themselves during porn. And then we had like a series of what I can only describe as the most British protests outside of Parliament. You see of like women in like tweed and jodhpurs sitting on men's faces outside of Parliament. Like just this one of them like drinking a cup of tea, and it's just and singing like Monty Python, sit on my face and tell me that you love me. But all those signs like shame on you, we come too, and like because so when it got repealed very quietly, they were just like, I was like, and that's what I was doing, the Come Together book, and I was like, we have to have a squirting story in this to celebrate. So you're kind of like, I mean, going to jail for a sexy book is good, like, but it's probably just a huge fine. What a hill to die on. What a face to die on.
Gosh, we are running out of time, aren't we? Yeah. Do we have time for one more question, maybe? Anyone have a quick question? Yeah, quick question.
That's on us, really, isn't it? So.
Yeah.
No, good.
There's one here.
Oh, sorry.
We can hear you.
No, but we can hear you.
Yeah.
They're recording it on live stream, so if we can,
I was just wondering, now that your books are out, whether there was any kind of single response from a reader that had either made you see something new in your work that wasn't there before, or had made you go, yes, that's exactly what I wanted to say.
That's a really good question. So about reader response to the work, and if there was anything within those responses that kind of, oh no. Wow.
Do you want me to repeat it? Yeah, whether there had been any reader responses that felt very true to what we were trying to achieve, right? Like if anyone had... Oh, there you're back. Do you want to say it as well?
I'm back. Yeah, just whether there was anything in those responses that helped you sort of see something new in the book, or sort of affirmed something that you were aiming to do, I guess, if that's a fair summary of the question.
That's such a nice question. I feel like it's definitely... I think there's been stuff that's surprised me. Like a lot of people have really picked up on the mental health storyline in the book. That, just my character's brother is going through a lot of mental health stuff, and a lot of people just like said thank you to me for writing something that felt really true to what they've seen or gone through, especially like people who've seen it with a loved one. And I think because my book is like on the lighter side, it's a comedy, like I sometimes forget that there's a lot of dark stuff in there, because that is kind of my personality, like doing a lot of comedy and lightness, but also with dark stuff. And I forget. And so when people pick up on that, I'm really touched, and it means a lot that they've kind of found that, and they've been able to hold the light and the dark. So yeah, that's been really lovely to hear.
Everything for me, like everything that I've learned about the book, everything that I'm saying up here probably is through engaging with readers. I get a lot of messages on Instagram. It's the only time I've really enjoyed being on. So far, I mean, touch wood, I know it could all go dark so easily, but at the moment it's just like, just people who have, I don't know, like, just the fact that people understand it has been a surprise to me. I think that you don't write, you have this, I was reading the obituary of this poet, Robert Creeley, and somebody gave a speech saying that the most remarkable thing about him is that he shaped his audience, so there wasn't really anyone like him before, and he created an audience that made sense to him. I love that. Like, if there's one thing that I would love to achieve in my obituary, it's something like that, where it's like, you know, I think when you're writing books like this, there isn't a lot that's gone before, at least in modern consciousness. I hate being that kind of person that's like, this is the first time this has been done. Of course it isn't. There are so many great books that are legacy to this book. But I think in, like, yeah, modern consciousness, it's nice to know that it's finding readers that make perfect sense of it, a better sense that I can't think of anything specific right now because I get too nervous during these things, but there are, yeah, so many. I think like the binder stuff is the stuff that I was the most nervous about, I think, in the book, and the way that's been understood and taken forward, and the ending as well. I think the way that's been understood in terms of transfuturity has been like very beautiful to me, especially. And I think sometimes you're writing these things off instinct. Everything that I do is off impulse and instinct. It's a terrifying way to live and write. But then you're able to look back at yourself and the person that was writing the book and be like, oh yeah, I guess that would make sense for where I was at and the logic that came with it. So that's been really nice. Yeah.
I'm sort of thinking about, in 30 Things I Love About Myself, there's a moment where Instagram starts really talking to the main character and picking her up. And you talked a little bit about that the good is just as bad as getting the bad from the internet sometimes, and that's being just I felt like that was a nice complication. I want to talk a little bit about how it feels. We're in a strange place at the moment where back when I started doing webcomics about 16 years ago, people would comment all the time. And I've seen the internet change over the years, where people don't comment as much. Like, there's just an overwhelming amount of everything out there, and like, I mean, I don't comment on things. I don't have the energy either, and it feels like we really have stopped being readers who tell each other what work coins with us. In the same way. It's fascinating. I feel like back when I started, I made like no money from comics, but people commented a lot, and now those readers, we've sort of grown up together, they will buy the books, so I make more money than I ever do now, but I feel strangely more disconnected from readers than ever before. And so I just, almost as a thing for the audience, like, if there's books that you like out there, I just want to remind you to tell people about it, because it's so valuable, and also as a reminder to myself to tell people about what I liked in their books. I think that's a really important thing right now.
I agree.
I think that's a really lovely note to end on. Thank you. Did that well. Yes, thank you all so much for coming along. Hope you've enjoyed today's chat. And I just want to say a huge thank you to the Storytelling Centre for having us, and remind you all to go upstairs and buy books, and there'll be signings as well. But huge thank you to our wonderful panel. Yes, I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you very much, Lynsey.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you.